Hello, and welcome to this talk about adapting Jane Austen as part of Virtual JaneCon 2021. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you so much to Bianca and the team for putting together this great event. It's wonderful to be sharing Austen with people across the world. My name is Shamini, Shamini Kumar. I have done some adapting of Austen in my time. And I have done a lot of thinking about how to adapt Austen, particularly as a person of colour and what that means when approaching Austen and trying to adapt Austen for the 21st century. So yeah, I just want to go through some of the things that I have experienced, that I have thought about, that I've worked through, that I've got wrong, and some of the things that I've been thinking about and where I think the future might be in terms of adaptation, both for me personally and maybe even broader culture adaptations. So yeah, let's just kick straight off. This is me, the little kid dressed in the Australian flag. I am Australian. I've lived in Australia my whole life, basically. And this was taken on a day when something was happening at primary school to do with getting everybody into the vibe of being like in the colonial settler phase of Australian history. I don't know who the kid is that I'm standing next to. I feel like the teacher standing behind us was dressed as a koala. Props to my mum for making a costume that I fit into, that was literally the Australian flag. And I feel like this photo sums up how I felt about my race and my identity at that time. I grew up desperately wanting to be Australian. My mother's Filipino, my father is Sri Lankan, and I, at this phase of my life, felt really uncomfortable in Australia as a person of colour. I felt very much like what I wanted most was to fit in, and tried to do that with varying degrees of success, and occasionally some very cringeworthy photos turning up like this one. I grew up loving reading. I grew up reading all kinds of things, and my parents particularly encouraged me to read classic English literature, including Jane Austen, which I just fell in love with Pride and Prejudice when I was 10 or 12, around about that age. Now, in addition to my day job, I am the artistic director of 24 Carat Productions, and we're a theatre and production company based in Melbourne. We do productions throughout the year, but at the end of every year for the last 3 years, we've done an Austen adaptation along with our Austen Con, which has been either in person or online. And this year, hopefully, a hybrid of in-person and online events for a full day around Jane Austen. So yeah, it's Austen is something that is close to my heart. It's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about through the year because of the stuff that we do. So that's me. And let's just jump straight into some of the ways that I've thought about adapting Austen, the ways I've tried to adapt Austen. My first go was in 2017. And you may remember that was the bicentennial of Austen's death. And I'd been sort of inspired by kind of shows that were based on classic texts, but managed to make them really conversational about issues that are very current, things like feminism and power and race. And so the more I read about persuasion, the more I was starting to see those themes emerge. And the way that I wrote it was to try and find ways to have characters talk directly about the kinds of issues I wanted to discuss, like feminism and like slavery and the slave trade. And the way that I did that at this time was to create these servant characters who were unfortunately unnamed, but that was partly so that they could be of any gender. There wasn't any issues around that, but they were sort of constantly in the background, constantly behind the scenes, commenting on the action, commenting on their perspective from their class perspective and their economic perspective on the things that are stressful to the people who are more centre stage in Austen's novel. And here they're specifically talking about the Admiral and Mrs. Croft, who are Wentworth's kind of mentor and sister, and that Mrs. Croft is quite proud of having travelled with her husband. And one of the servants is like, well, they're kind of nice people. And the other one is like, well, they may well have been involved in the slave trade. We know from the book that Captain Wentworth first went to sea in 1806, and the slave trade, the British slave trade, was abolished only in 1807. So for the first year of his career, that may have been something that he was involved in, because the Royal Navy was involved in protecting, providing sort of military protection for British trade, and that included the slave trade. So it is entirely possible that Admiral Croft, whose career obviously went significantly before that, could have been involved in that kind of patrol, that kind of protection duty, I guess you'd say. I don't really know all the military terms. And so this is something that may well have been known, like general knowledge that people would have known at Austen's time, but it's not something that we as modern readers necessarily think about. So it's doing the kind of work of wanting to bring up this issue and make it text rather than subtext. Another way it comes up is talking about Mrs. Smith and her trying to get hold of her husband's inheritance. So you may remember that Mrs. Smith is Anne's poor friend that lives in Bath, literally poor in the sense of she doesn't have a lot of money, and confides in Anne that Mr. Elliot, who's Anne's cousin and Anne's suitor, he sort of swindled her out of her husband's estate inheritance, the money she would have otherwise had to live on. And here they're talking about, well, where does that money come from? Well, if it's investments in the West Indies, does that actually mean it's investments in slave plantations? And Mrs. Smith says, well, I don't know. But it's a choice between that or basically starving in the street. And that's a very stark choice that women in her place would have had, is that investments and the income that that is talked about in Austen, like, the 50 pounds a year, 200 pounds a year, whatever it is often because that's investments. It might be because of production off land, but it may be because of investments. And a lot of those investments for people at the time would have involved in some way the West Indies, even though the slave trade had been abolished. Slavery itself was not abolished. Or it may well have involved investments in colonial enterprises in places like India. And so to bring out the ways that the exploitation of people of colour worldwide formed a kind of underpinning of the economic the whole economic system of the time, which people may have been at least a little bit aware of in Austen's time, but to make that subtext to text. And in trying to do that, there's a couple of examples of the way we've done it in the script. And we've done it with other things in terms of trying to make clearer things about power, or have comment on the way that women exercise power in that time, and so on. In terms of race, I did try to cast more diversely. That sounds like a cop-out for the fact that we ended up with pretty much an all-white cast. So there's a few reasons for that. And in hindsight, it's not something I would do again. And in hindsight, I think I could have done better. I ended up casting a lot of people I know, and I know a lot of white people. And I think the other issue is that when you're putting out a casting call for a piece that's based on Jane Austen, people will assume, even if you've written in the casting call that you are looking for people of any race, people will assume you're looking to cast a white person. And I hadn't perhaps thought through all of those issues as much at the time. And yeah, that's something that I do regret a little bit, that these are things that we talked about but didn't actually embody in our cast. It was a little bit similar, to be honest, with the next year. We did Second Impressions of Pride and Prejudice, which is obviously based on Pride and Prejudice. And the way it was done was that we had a almost like a Greek chorus, so not a singing chorus, although they did a couple of songs in the play, sort of headed up by Mary Bennett, who commented on more of the social issues. And a lot of it in this piece was more about social issues than specifically racial issues. I will show you some of those. So the chorus says to Elizabeth, you know, picking up on the language from the book, of all this you might have been mistress. And Mary makes the comment about where does that money come from? That again, that question of where does the £10,000 come from? He has tenants who work on land that's inherited. He invests the money well, and that includes plantations and ships and mines. And the other part that we have here is, again, picking up on Austen's sentence, how much pleasure or pain is in his power to bestow. And what does it mean that male white men are put in charge of these whole estates and given so much power over the economic and social fortunes of their tenants? And that was more what we did in Second Impressions of Pride and Prejudice. Again, it was a very white cast, and it wasn't one that I particularly found ways to explore race as an issue, separate to class and separate to the other social things in that setting. So 2 years ago, sorry, oops, let me go back. 2 years ago, we did Pride and Prejudice in 5 years. That was obviously a sequel to Pride and Prejudice. And in this piece, we had the Bennet sisters gathering together for almost like a reunion of the sisters, and to look at where they were at 5 years from the end of the book. And I'd set it up so that we had a housekeeper character who had a servant who was just a new servant that we sort of gradually found out was actually somebody who had time travelled back from the 21st century who wanted to experience Regency life. And this servant sort of gradually through the play becomes more and more disillusioned with what she's seeing. She's seeing discrimination, she's seeing inequality, she's seeing the difficulties that people of colour have, that people who are less high-born have, that people find it difficult to move in terms of their economic situation. She's seeing the difficulties that people have who would now be identifying as potentially LGBT people. And she becomes really disillusioned with the idea of Regency as comfort food. She's previously seen Regency England and Jane Austen's stories as an escape from 21st century Melbourne and something sort of nice and light and fluffy. And she's been reminded that there was real oppression at this time, and that oppression obviously is still ongoing in lots of different ways. And she comes up against some of the ideas that are, again, not necessarily always explicit in Austen, but that sort of underlie a lot of the class distinctions and the issues that the barriers that people come up against. That, you know, high-born people think they deserve to be where they are. Low-born people are kept busy and tired and uneducated, so they don't complain. And I don't think things have changed all that much. Perhaps we see it in different ways in our society today, but perhaps something to think about, whole separate thing. So it was really trying to put the text or the stories of Austen, particularly Pride and Prejudice, and what might have happened to these characters, into direct conversation with a 21st century person. And it was dealing with issues like poverty, inequality, sexuality, race, money. This person wasn't prepared for the realities or the difficult things that often get glossed over in Austen adaptations. And I came to the end of Pride and Prejudice in 5 years. And again, it was an all-white cast. Even though we talked about some issues to do with race, even though we talked about some issues to do with equality. And during the pandemic, we decided to actually put on a show, even though we couldn't gather in real life, in person, and really pushed out in terms of specifically making it very, very specifically about identity and about how people with different identities, or perhaps marginalised identities, interact with Austen. And that was a piece called Introduction. Oh, going back again. That's a piece called Introduction to Emma. And the concept was that it was live streamed on YouTube. And the concept was that it was basically a Zoom classroom in a university kind of setting with a teacher and a handful of students who are all there to read Austen. And this is their first class of the year, and they're starting with Emma, the book Emma. And into the class you have Emma, Mr. Knightley and Harriet, the actual characters from the book, who then have to interact with these other classmates from the 21st century who have really different ideas to them about their own lives, really. And so this is some of the stuff that we talked about. And one of the ideas that I came across as I was doing a lot of research for this is from an academic called Sheena Pugh, who mostly writes about fan fiction. But I thought it applied in really interesting ways, actually, to the way I thought about adaptation. And Pugh says that there are two kind of broad categories of fan fiction, and one of them is more of. So people who write more of fan fiction want kind of more of the same things that they loved about the original. People who write more from fan fiction are the people who want more from the original text that they're interacting with, and so write things that are a little bit outside of that world and sort of stretch that world a little bit. An example, I guess you could say, with something like Star Trek, I'm also a fan, you'd have the more of fan fiction being more stories of the Starship Enterprise or more stories of Captain Janeway on Voyager. The more from would be, non-canonical pairings, finding different worlds, having people who didn't interact in the series interact in your piece, particularly if you're raising issues around race or sexuality, things like that. So that's the kind of more of versus more from. And obviously in any piece of fan fiction, you can have a little bit of both, and that's fine. But when it comes to adaptation, I think this distinction actually helps me a lot to think about how things are a little bit of more of or a little bit of more from when the way those interact. Because like fan fiction, adaptation is starting with a text and it's kind of branching out. In both of them, you kind of have to leave the original text behind to a certain extent, and obviously differing extents depending on whether you're writing fan fiction or an adaptation, and how it so you have to leave it behind to a certain extent, and what direction you take that in, whether you're doing the more of, or whether, particularly when it comes to race, doing a little bit more from is a good way for me to think about how adaptation works. And I think some of the stuff that I'd done before had a lot of more of. They were very more of heavy with a little bit of added more from. And for Introduction to Emma, I was pretty determined that I wanted it to be quite different, and specifically wrote a character who was probably, just me in disguise, but had some things to say about her interaction with Austen. And I'm just going to share just a clip of it with you.
No matter what I'm wearing, when I look in the mirror, the person staring back at me is not an Austen heroine. She doesn't belong in Austen's world at all. That world of gentility and order and happy endings.
I think that those things that you associate with Austen's work, they're more about the interpretation that you're giving it to the work.
What does it say about me that, what is it that I want that?
What is it that you want?
I want to be in one of these novels. I want to be that accomplished and witty and clever woman that people look up to. And I suppose I also just want to wear a pretty costume and be rich and have nothing to do but order servants around.
That's harder work than you might think.
No, my love.
Well, it is. I'm just saying.
I think you'd be better off not saying anything about hard work.
And I know that the investment that the people lived off, they were so heavily entangled with all the worst parts of British colonialism. And I know that the landowners kept their profits by maintaining the poverty of the people who worked the land for them.
No, wait a moment. That is not quite
And what does
the
it
way
say
it
about
is.
me that I want that life? That I love the idea of that life?
I love it too. Is that bad?
I think it's worse for me. I think it's okay for you to love it.
That seems unfair. Why is it okay for me but not for you?
Because me loving it, it's a slap in the face of all the people of my own race who suffered under British oppression.
Yeah, so this was a piece that I very much determined we weren't going to pull any more punches. We weren't going to tiptoe around issues about race. And it was really putting people into conversation very directly. And one of the characters obviously was written to be a person of colour. This, I should also say, is a small plug that the entire video is available to be watched as a stream. You can on our website, 24caratproductions.com, you can go to our store and you can organise to get a link to watch the entire thing if you're interested. But in this particular piece, we thought a lot and actually made explicit that the two slides I just showed you, where we talked about the more of versus more from distinction, was actually from this particular show. We actually used it. And it got me thinking more about adaptations, about the ways that Austen's been adapted for screen, and about what I want from my adaptations, both the adaptations that I write and the adaptations that I watch. So let's just go through a few.
No matter what I'm wearing, when I look in,
let's go forward into the more of. Now, more of, look, these there's so many of them out there, and we love them. We love them. They're fabulous. The most recent Emma Thompson's Sense and Sensibility, the 1995 Pride and Prejudice. They are more of the Austen that we know and love, but they are still, in their own ways, departures from the text. They build on the text. There is no such thing as an entirely faithful adaptation. Pride and Prejudice from 95 is thought of as being so faithful, but it opens with a scene that Austen didn't write, which is Bingley and Darcy talking to each other and with no women around. They're on horseback, they're talking about Netherfield Park. And Austen didn't write that scene, and she never wrote a scene with only men present because she had no idea what men talked about when there were no women present, because she was not there for that. So my point is not that it's trash or that it's terrible, we should stop watching it. My point is that we should acknowledge it as an adaptation and as something that just as much as any other piece takes Austen as a jumping off point and moves forward. And there's nothing wrong with the more of adaptations. They're delightful and they're so much fun, and the costumes are amazing, and we should enjoy them. But for so long, pretty much this is all we've had as far as Austen adaptations go. In terms of more from, there's a few different categories. One of them is modern adaptations, and you can think about Clueless, which still features a white woman at the centre, but does have people of colour in the piece. Something a bit more of the kind of thing I'm thinking about in this would be Bride and Prejudice, or I don't know how many of you know, From Prada to Nada, which is an adaptation of Sense and Sensibility set in modern day Los Angeles. I put modern in scare quotes because some of these are starting to age a little bit, but that's okay. These modern adaptations really speak to Austen's universality in lots of ways, but and look, they're great. They're so much fun. It's really, I always find it interesting to see what takes people have on it, the things that people pick up on, things that people translate, and the way that translates into modern day. It can have the effect, taken in the broader context of the fact that we don't have adaptations really of Austen with people of colour set in Regency period. It can have the effect of basically saying, here's the Regency and this is for the white people. And if you're a person of colour and you want Austen, well, you can take Austen and take it and do your own thing with it, but you let us have the real Regency, the real Austen. Can have that distancing effect. That's not a slight on any of these particular adaptations at all. at all. But it is sort of indicative, I will say, of where culture might be in terms of looking at historical works of fiction and depictions of people of colour in history. We do have things like Mansfield Park and to extent Sanditon, where they're set in that Regency period. They've taken the Austen story and they've added a little bit of an emphasis on issues of people that affect people of colour. It's a bit hard with Sanditon because it's an unfinished novel, but certainly Mansfield Park, the Frances O'Connor version, is quite famous for that, picking up on the issues of slavery and the Bertram's involvement with slavery. And I would probably say that in some ways, the pieces I had written prior to Introduction to Emma fall into the Mansfield Park kind of situation, where the main cast and the people who are the key characters are still all white, but they are talking about issues that affect people of colour. And this is, I think it's a good start. I think it's a great start. It's a good in and of itself too, but in terms of the direction that we're wanting to take it of involving people of colour in Austen adaptations and telling Austen from the point of view of people of colour, it's a start. And that's pretty much where Austen adaptation is at the moment. This is what we've got. We have not had any significant adaptations for screen that feature people of colour in some of those classic heroine or hero roles. So looking at other approaches to adaptation of historical fiction, I'm just going to go through a couple more things. And this is not Austen. And we see in David Copperfield, which I do recommend to you as a lot of fun, it's just colour conscious casting, where race isn't mentioned at all in the piece, but they've just cast people of all races, from all backgrounds. They haven't bothered to make brother and sister match up in terms of race, or parents and children match up in terms of race. It's just purely casting terrific people from all backgrounds in this piece. And there's some merit to that. It's given us Dev Patel as David Copperfield and some fabulous actors in this piece. And it's not a piece that's necessarily interested in dealing with issues of race. Which is fine. Not every piece has to be interested in specifically dealing with issues of race, but but it's just worth pointing out as we think about this, that yes, it is, we could say an achievement or an accomplishment or a great thing to see Dev Patel in this role, but Ian Ritchie's not necessarily actually commenting on race through this piece. Which again is fine, but at some point we might also want something more as well. My next example, it would be remiss of me to not at some point talk about Bridgerton when it comes to adapting Austen with race. So many people, when Bridgerton was first released, said to me, "Oh, have you seen it? Have you seen it? You're into Austen, you must see this." It's not Austen. It's certainly set in the same time, and very prominently had a person of colour as one of the love interests. Race is mentioned, so we have families that are of a particular race that function as a family of that particular race. It is mentioned as to how people of colour came to have that prominence in that society. And so race is a real thing that is discussed, but it is kept very, very light. There's no particular incidences of racism or systemic racism to be dealt with. And some people, look, I've done a bit of reading about this. Some people, people of colour, loved that, just wanted to get lost in the fantasy of it, the lightness of it, just enjoy the costumes and the swooniness of the love story. And that's fine, that's fabulous. But I also read some commentary where people felt that was unsatisfactory in terms of dealing with race. So it's a little bit kind of, I guess we can say, a mixed kind of reaction to the way that race was portrayed in Bridgerton. And again, I'm talking about reading pieces from people of colour, whose opinions I think should be foregrounded when it comes to talking about race in adaptations. So what is the future of adaptation in terms of Jane Austen? We have yet to see a major adaptation of an Austen piece with a person of colour set in the Regency era. Just today, we were all on Twitter. Some of us were on Twitter, hoping for Henry Golding to be cast as Wentworth or as Darcy, or as anybody really. We would take Henry Golding as any of those characters. We'd love to see, people of colour cast as characters from an Austen novel. Cast all of them. Set it in the Regency era. People of colour look fabulous in the dresses and the breeches and all of that as well. And that's kind of looking at it from a David Copperfield kind of perspective. Let's just cast them. Let's just do it. Why not? There's absolutely no reason not to, and it would be so much fun. But the thing that I've been sort of fixated on the most is I would love to see people of colour cast in specific roles, and to explore how that shapes the way that that character might be seen. Let me give you an example. What if Frederick Wentworth was a person of colour? We know that Anne's family didn't like him because of his lowly financial status and lowly social status. What if he was also a person of colour, and one of the added reasons they had that was never spoken about in the novel was because he was a person of colour? Now, we know that there were a lot of Indian sailors who had come from India with various merchant ships during that period of the East India Company and British colonialism, and that had basically been dumped on the docks in London. And so it would not be entirely out of the question for Captain Wentworth to have connections there. And some of those people did actually marry, and there were, interracial marriages that happened. How would that change the story? How would it change the way we see Anne? How would it change the way we see Frederick? How would them being biracial, how would them being an interracial couple influence that story? And I think that would be something really interesting to explore. You can imagine it with other characters in other novels as well. It'd be really interesting if, for example, Harriet in Emma were a person of colour, and how would that influence the way we see the condescension, particularly in the relationship between her and Emma? I think those kinds of things would be really interesting to explore, to take the characters, to cast them very deliberately, and use that casting to not necessarily have great speeches or to necessarily dig into a lot of really traumatic things, but to actually just see what light and shade, what kind of nuance does that add to the story? Does it bring to our understanding of race in Regency era? What understanding does it bring to the way we see race in Austen? My pledge is that what I want to do is to do better at the way I write Austen adaptations as well with regards to people of colour. And so my plan for 2022 is an Austen adaptation, of Mansfield Park with a biracial Fanny. And I'm kind of excited about planning that out already, where 24 Carat is working on Sense and Sensibility, a musical for this year, in which Colonel Brandon has to deal with a lot of the harm that the British Army and the East India Company caused in India. But I think I can do better. I think we can do better. And so Fanny Price 2022 as a person of colour, and how that impacts the way that she's seen in that family, about how she feels about herself and the way that she acts. I think that's going to be really interesting. I hope it will be really interesting. So that's what I'm thinking. That's who I am. That's what I've been doing. That's what I've got wrong. That's what I've done. That's what's been going through my head. If you want to follow me on Instagram or Twitter, I'm at SharminiMe. 24 Carat Productions, you can find us on also Instagram, Facebook, or our website is 24caratproductions.com. We're trying to incorporate streaming options into pretty much all our shows now, including, as I mentioned before, the Emma video is still available. Yeah, that's what I have to say. Please reach out if you've got any questions or comments or thoughts or suggestions. I just want to finish by saying thank you again to Bianca. Thank you to everyone who has participated, and thank you to you for watching this video. And happy Austening.